Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for coming. And although the title here says Speeding Up Windows Security Assessments with Ancient Math, the reason I'm here is that the algorithm I developed and the tool, I think, can be useful for a lot of different things. And I know typically when I go to a security conference, I hope for two things. One is a good idea I can use back at work. And then the second may be a tool or two that I can also use back at work. And I'm pretty sure I'll be able to give you both of those here today. So what I had in mind for the next 30 minutes or so was to step through about four things here. First is the problem, or what got me going down this path. You know, we say in open source circles, what's the itch you're trying to scratch? That's really what I want to address briefly. Then I wanted to show some intuitive examples of the solution at work. And I figured rather than dwelling on the math, because that could be a little tedious, really I wanted to show more a intuitive example of the sort of results that this will get you, and you can decide for yourself if it's something you could use. Then of course a quick demo, and follow up with future plans. Then one quick disclaimer regarding my employer. So as it says here, I work for Kaiser Permanente in a cybersecurity capacity, but for the purposes of this talk, that's about as far as that connection goes. Kaiser just wanted me to make clear that what I will be talking about is not at all an official Kaiser algorithm or tool or anything like that. It's kind of the opposite, really. So just keep that in mind. So with that out of the way, let me talk about the problem that kind of got me working on this and brought me here today. So in the security work that my colleagues and I do, we do a lot of things. We wear a lot of different hats. One of the more satisfying things we do, for me anyway, is when we're dealing with compiled binaries, especially Windows programs. And there's a couple of reasons why I find that particularly satisfying. One is that it's difficult. And anytime something is very difficult and then you're occasionally successful at it, that's always very rewarding. The other reason that I find this very satisfying is that it has a huge potential impact. So in a place the size of Kaiser, for example, we have about 180,000 employees. And so when you're dealing with things like client programs that are being pushed out there, if there's some security concern in one of these things, the potential impact can be pretty big. And it's, you know, honestly, it's sort of gratifying to demo that. It tends to be one of those jaw-dropping things when you say, look at this. This is what can go wrong. So working with compiled binaries is great, one of my favorite things. But, and this is a huge but I'm putting in here, doing this sort of work is immensely time-consuming. And I know that's not just my own perspective. People who are also good at this will tell you, when you're doing things like reverse engineering or, you know, heaven help you, you're searching for an exploit of some kind, we're talking really something in the realm of days, even weeks, as you're, you know, getting deep into a program, trying to find what it is you're trying to discover, or, you know, get it to pop or something like that. So it is a huge, huge time suck. I just, with a slight nod to the whole steampunk thing here, Lewis Carroll. So the we're not a security research shop, and so as the, you know, the guy is saying here, you know, I ain't got time for this. We're typically under a lot of time pressure, and I would say our workflow, honestly, it's sort of like, it's as if you have a fire hose where they turn it off and on every once in a while. We do get some lulls, but by and large, you know, the stuff is coming at us pretty fast. So we have to be pretty smart about the work that we take on, and that includes reverse engineering and exploit hunting. And last cheesy slide, I promise. Honestly, for me, doing this sort of work, I often felt a little bit like our pensive Alice here, where I'd be wondering, you know, okay, I know how long this is going to probably take, and is it really worth firing up IDA Pro or Immunity or something, and really going down the rabbit hole, you know, yet again to see if I can get something that's worth my time, some sort of security finding or maybe an exploit, something like that. And the more that I've been doing this work over time, the more I had this growing conviction that there's a problem, and that problem is there's a tools gap. And typically when we use the tools made available to us, when we're dealing with compiled programs, no source code, black box, the tools available to us fall into one of two extremes. We have either what I would call strings and friends on the left. It's very quick, in seconds, minutes at the most, you can get some information. If you're really lucky, perhaps you'll see something like a connect string or maybe something that stands out as a likely credential, and then you're done, you've won. But I will assert that most of the time, these quick static analysis tools will miss what you can get out of a compiled program. Then, so when you're done with that, what's left? Well, then generally there's this huge leap where we're getting into the world of serious debugging, and that's where we're firing up IDA Pro, Immunity, what have you. And that's where then instead of things taking seconds or minutes, now the work ahead of you, it's going to demand hours and days and even weeks. I've heard of some guys taking months, to get to the bottom of an exploit. You miss nothing, but there's this huge time gap. And over time, I became convinced or really craving something to fill this tools gap. And to me, it felt like what was needed here was what I would call a triage tool. And for me, I concluded what this tool would do, if I could find it, would be really two things. And one would be ultimately to predict the behavior of a Windows program, it's a tall order, but really we could boil it down to two things. Predicting the capabilities of a program, that would be great. And also, if we could say in a sort of word cloud sort of way, this program you're looking at looks awfully similar to these other programs you may already know about, or perhaps at least we have a catalog of programs and we can say, here's where it belongs. Because if you can predict capabilities and also say, here are the peer group binaries that this thing seems to belong to, that's pretty much predicting behavior, and that would be great. If we could predict behavior, then we'd have the triage where I could say, okay, this thing is worth it. It's worth climbing the mountain or going down the rabbit hole, if you want to use that analogy. Or, it looks like maybe based on our predicted behavior, it's probably not worth it, so we'll skip it. So I knew what I was looking for, looked around, couldn't find it. There were some nice intriguing things such as Mandiant Impash. The Japanese Search Center also has some interesting tools that kind of came close but didn't quite work for me. I had a couple catalysts in my thinking, and the first one was becoming familiar with the Radare open source debugger tool. And for those who may not have worked with Radare, it's a nice little tool. It's a rewrite. And unlike most debuggers, it kind of embraces the command line interface. And I would say the thing that really sold me on Radare is that it embraces the Unix philosophy of, the standard in, standard out, standard error. And once you kind of get used to working with that, it's really addictive because then in a sort of looping or shell type way, you can pipe things to make it do whatever you want, as opposed to most monolithic code analysis tools. They tend to be just that, they're monolithic. Here it is, learn it or go home kind of thing. So I liked Radare, and that made me think, if I were to do this myself, I would want it to have a Radare type of feel to it. And now the second catalyst in my thinking, and what really got me working on this, and what I'll get to here in a moment, was reading a fascinating story from the Cold War about how a KGB agent, Yuri Tatrov, he was able to crack the identities of CIA agents on a massive scale. And the way Tatrov did this, or what Tatrov did, was he determined there were about 26 metrics or bits of publicly available information about all the US employees overseas in foreign embassies. And looking at these 26 metrics and using a little deductive reasoning on Tatrov's part, he was able to figure out quite accurately who were actually State Department people and then who were people who were probably actually CIA. And it's an interesting story because of how well it worked. Once Tatrov has tagged a guy as being, okay, this is actually a CIA person masquerading as state, then the KGB could follow him for years, and this became a huge problem for the CIA. They basically tore themselves apart trying to find what they thought was some highly placed mole feeding authoritative lists of all their agents back to Moscow. And it wasn't until after the collapse of the Soviet Union that the truth came out, which was, there had been no high-level mole, not for this anyway. It was just that Tatrov's technique had worked so well, it was as if he had access to an authoritative list of all the agents overseas. And it was an impressive story, and it got me thinking, so if you can use metadata in this way to actually suss out, who's a secret agent, even though they're trying to hide. Maybe something like this could be done with Windows programs to be able to predict behavior. And I thought, let's see if we can do this. I wasn't sure, but I thought it's worth a try. And at this point, then I decided to start hacking away on things just to meet my own needs. And the idea I had basically was kind of twofold. It's sort of in the spirit of Tatrov and other things. I said, well, let's do this. Let's try to push static analysis of Windows programs to the limit. And by that, I mean just squeezing all the metadata that's at all useful out of a program that we can, and just slicing it forwards and backwards. Then push math to the limit to say, what can we do with this metadata? And can we then predictive capabilities and also say, here are the programs that it seems to belong with. It's going to behave like these other things you know about. And then we can say we're predicting behavior without even having to run the program. So I started work, and getting the metadata wasn't too hard. Tried a lot of things, but figured out what was useful and what was not. It's about 20 things that were most useful. And had an interesting time applying my own algorithms, which was kind of fun in a geeky sort of way. And they worked decently well. But I ultimately had to put my ego aside a little bit when I realized that there was a much better way to do this. And what that better way is it's a concept called Euclidean distance. And basically, everyone's probably heard of the Pythagorean theorem. And the Euclidean distance, it's basically, that's the superset of all that. The Pythagorean theorem is just one example. And what I found really made this click, and my own twist to all this, was then figuring out that in this particular case, adding logarithms to the mix really made things kind of click into place. And that's kind of what I'm most proud of in a way. And I'll just quickly mention here, if anyone is wondering, well, Euclidean distance, interesting, why is it so elegant, or, what's the attraction? I'll just refer you to this website, betterexplained.com. Does a beautiful job explaining, why it's so elegant and sort of a universal truth kind of way of doing things. And let's have a couple examples here just so you can see what Euclidean distance does. And again, emphasizing just an intuitive understanding so you can see if it's the kind of thing that might be useful to you. Now here's the classic approach, 2,000-year-old math here. And we're just going to look at a group of countries because everyone can kind of relate to that. And here we're just going to say which countries are most similar to Spain. And here we're saying in the classic approach, well, Spain, and that seems about right. We notice that India and China are extreme outliers. They're way different, apparently. So, okay. Here's another example. Again, 2,000-year-old formula. We're going to say which countries are the most similar to the Netherlands. And when I say most similar, what's going on here is we're using demographics, culture, climate, a whole bunch of different things. Just a very fuzzy sort of match. Now here is where I had to stop and say, I don't think the classic approach is quite right. Because according to the classic math here, it's saying, well, Mali in West Africa is the most similar to the Netherlands. And to me, that doesn't seem right at all. Again, we see India and China are just extremely different. One more quick one here. So same thing, classic approach. And you might notice that the index here is enormous, 1.5 billion. Again, we're seeing that India and China are extreme outliers. So what's going on here? Well, unfortunately, although the classic Euclidean approach is excellent in theory, in a classroom setting, when you're measuring things like countries or secret agents or Windows compiled programs, each element of that thing is measured very differently. So you have things like a percentage number, or then you have a population number. And it turns out with countries, you may have guessed, population numbers just tend to be big numbers, and it blows everything up. And that had me a little bummed out because the proof for Euclidean distance is very neat, and I wanted to preserve that sort of universal truth in whatever I was doing. So I tried a lot of things, and to make a long story short, rather than going over all the things I tried and didn't like, it turned out, as is so often the case, that one of the simplest things really worked by far the best, and that was just to say, take the logarithm of each raw measurement and then feed it into Euclidean distance. And as people may know, so with logarithms, everything tends to crunch down to smaller numbers. Everything basically winds up between 0 and 10 for most purposes. And that keeps it all at a sort of human scale while still preserving, good accuracy. And it worked great. I tried it in a lot of things. I tried it on some example programs. I tried it comparing cars. I tried it comparing countries. It has this sort of universal, it works quality to it. And I thought, well, this is great. And I was surprised when I was Googling around that there didn't seem to be much of an exact match for this. In fact, I only found one clear example of where other people seem to be using this. There were a couple of French guys in 2006. They had a paper, math paper, and they were using what looked to be the same approach. But that was about it that I could find anyway. And that's another reason that brought me here today. I thought, oh, I got to share this. This works so well on so many things. And again, I don't want to dwell on the calculations. There's links at the end that people can follow to their heart's content. But for people who want to see the exact formula, here you go. I'm going to call it BSidesSF distance because I came up with it in a clean room setting, so I can call it whatever I want, I guess. And it's basically the Euclidean distance formula, except that each thing you feed into it, x1 through x whatever, you just take the log first, and that's all it is, and it works great. And to give just some quick, again, intuitive examples of why I like this so much, let's revisit our country comparison again. This is, again, the fuzzy, all aspects of different countries. We're going to ask again with our updated, what I call BSidesSF distance, which countries are the most similar to Italy? Ask that question again. Well, here, Spain again, that's right. Now, what I like here is, and there are many examples, but this is just a couple of them, is you can see that the developed countries kind of form one ledge, and then Norway starts getting a little weird and cold and everything, and then you get off to the less developed countries, and then Mali is apparently quite different. And I would say intuitively that's about right. Let's look at the Netherlands again, this time with the updated formula. And this really was reassuring to me, one of many dozens of examples I could pick. So Mali now, instead of being the most similar to the Netherlands, is considered the most different. And it's like, yes, that's what we want to see. We see that Germany is considered the most similar, feels about right, followed closely by Norway and so on. Then we have sort of a group of the developed countries. There's kind of a step change as we get away from those countries into less developed countries. Anyway, you get the idea. It's doing what you would expect it to do if a person was telling you, well, these are how these countries compare. And just, for what it's worth, here's Egypt. And again, things have settled down a lot. China and India are spread out much more evenly based on what they really are, not just the populations. So with that, I had enough to start making my own life easier. And I started working on this tool, which I have a GitHub repo I'll show in a minute. Started in Python because Python is always a good place to start. I switched to Go after a while because Go has really nice capabilities of doing parallel processing. And I realized that this thing was pretty computation intensive. I wanted to be able ultimately to spread the workload out over all the cores available. To be honest, I haven't tapped that yet, but that's coming. And Go is fast enough that actually has let me postpone that a bit. But Go was great. I highly recommend it. It's been good too because the work that I get to do on this tends to be, it comes in fits and starts. Most of the time there's something else I have to do. But Go works well for when you have to come back to your code base. You also need a place to store metadata. SQLite's awesome for that. And the tool is designed to be drop-dead simple to use. Again, we're talking about a workflow where we're in a constant time crush. Basically, the more you use it, the better the metadata becomes. And here's what I would say is a rough histogram of what the functionality of the actual tool does for me today, or myself and my colleagues. And I call it WRU, not because I have any passion about that, but just I was thinking in terms of typing at the command line, what are you file, and then have it come back and tell me. Most of what I like about it is that it tells you, in a word cloud sort of way, what does this given program most seem to resemble, and how close is that resemblance? Then also we can see, what functionality does this given program seem to have, or what can we be sure it does? Also gives a swag assessment, which is good if you're farming out work to junior staff. You can say, well, just look at the ones that have a big attack surface. And finally, the other thing it does, I put in a while back is using Bayes' theorem, because there are times when a given executable just isn't yielding a lot of good metadata. And in those cases, Bayes' theorem is great because it says, well, given the metadata we have and the metadata we have on all the other files we've ever seen, we can predict, at least with some level of confidence, what this new program is going to do. And I'll try to show one example of where that sort of saved my bacon in one piece of work. So yeah, with that, let me try and switch to a quick demo here of the tool, now that we've gone over the underlying algorithm. Let's see if we can flip over. Okay, good. Can people see that okay, I hope? Good enough? Okay. Let's see if we can make it bigger. Yeah. Let's make this bigger. We want to make the, yeah. All right, let's try that. Oh, come on. Still nothing, huh? There we go. Yep. All right, that should work. Okay. There's always something with the demo. So, let me put down the mic for 1 second. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. So here what we have, and for a whole lot of reasons involving NDA, and I don't want to get in trouble for it, we have 4 files from what we'll call Acme Medical, but these are real files from a vendor, and not Acme Medical, obviously. What I typically like to do is I sort of loop over things just to quickly get some feedback and then be able to decide which of these things is worth pursuing and which is not. So in this case, let's suppose that I've decided, you know, we really only have time to dig on maybe one file, and we're particularly concerned about networking. So we'll just run it, and pretty quickly we'll have some feedback. And so instead of having to go into every single file, I can say, okay, which one am I going to pick here? We're getting our Bayesian estimates, 30% on one, and so on. Okay, and there we are. So now, instead of having to spend a lot of time digging into each file, I can say, okay, I'm going to go for 03 because it has the highest Bayesian probability of doing some networking, and we know that it absolutely does 30 networking functions the others we're not sure about. So, poof, you know, I've saved tons of hours right there, at least quite a few hours. So now, let me just do one thing that I think will show sort of the word cloud type functioning, which may be a good way of just seeing, you know, what kind of work does it do. So we have Cygwin utilities, about 380 of them. That's basically Unix utilities running on Windows. Kind of show you that really quick. So let's, just to give you a sense of the kind of matching it does, let's suppose that we had no idea what GCC does. Now we know that that's the GNU compiler, but you know, for now, we'll just say we have no idea what GCC is. So it runs, and it will tell us that, okay, this GCC thing, whatever it is, it's very similar to a C++ compiler. The distance is very close. And also, it's pretty similar to some code coverage tools, and that's exactly right. So without knowing anything about what's really going on within the assembly code within GCC, we can say, looks like it's a compiler, certainly has something to do with code generation. And we can actually, if we wanted to get a little bit more, we could bump up the number of peers, and we get even more, and it also confirms it's sort of code stuff. Oh, one other thing too, if you run the tool without any options, it gives you, you know, tons of feedback on how to use it. It's painful looking right now when you do that, but anyway, it will tell you how to use it. And let me back up one. I wanted to also show the Bayes thing, because this is actually quite handy in some situations. So here, let me clear this. Okay, so here we have a mysterious file. We'll say it's mysterious, Acme Viewer. And again, this is an actual vendor file, just renamed because you know, I don't want to get in trouble. Now, initially, what this tool will tell us is, well, it doesn't appear to have any networking. Let's suppose we're concerned about networking in this context. However, let me back up. And if we add Bayes to the mix, sorry, typing one-handed here. It will take just a little longer because Bayes stuff adds a little math, but here we go. So now it's saying, okay, we didn't initially see any networking going on in this file, but according to Bayes and all the other files we've ever seen, the probability of this thing doing networking is about 38%. Now that's actually a lot higher than most files, and it turns out that indeed, yeah, there is something to it. This is I'm going to cheat a little bit here because this is a real vendor file and I know what's going on. Just, it happens to have some stuff in it that we'll reveal. Yeah, and there we go. And so although it wasn't immediately apparent, Bayes did tip me off that this thing probably was doing some networking, and indeed, buried deep within it, there was some stuff. The strings just happened to work out that way, but certainly first looking at the assembly and everything, it wasn't quite that obvious. So Bayes is great for that. When you really need to be sure you're not missing anything, it'll alert you to stuff that might be going on. So let's see, I think that sort of works as a quick demo. Let me see if I can slip back here. And, oops. So we can get our workspace back. There we go, come on. Not entirely, okay. There we go, okay. There's, yeah, so let me then just kind of wrap it up a bit here and just comment briefly on how well does it work. For me, it's worked very well. Otherwise, I honestly wouldn't want to share it. It's gone from being a hobby to something very handy. And I'll just share that not too long ago, this thing really made me look like a hero once at work. There was a sort of a hurry-up assessment we had where about 11 in the morning, some VIPs dropped some stuff in my lap and said, we need this as soon as possible. It was one of those situations, where things had sort of an unpleasant vibe to them. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about that way. And to make a long story short, in about 2.5 hours, I was able to sort through the problem space that had been given to me and then come back and say, well, here's your answer. And basically, these 3 vendors over here, they all have problems. Here's what the problems are. This other vendor here looks clean. They're the ones you want to go with. And so that was something that might have taken at least a week, probably more, and I was able to get it done in about 2.5 hours. And it was really thanks to this tool. And I got a really nice email back, from some senior VIPs, and that was very gratifying. So it's proven its worth at least once in a huge way that way. And I can share too, as far as the tool goes, it helps me sleep better just in terms of, did I pick the right targets? Am I picking the right things to work on? Yes. The other thing actually it's good for is that it is really good at placating any auditors. If they say, well, why did you do this and not that? The numbers speak for themselves, so it's good that way. And yeah, finally then just touching upon future plans. So I will be the first to admit, because this tool is developed really in response to my own needs and, just in fits and starts as I've needed it to do things and figured out what works and does not work. It's grown, I would say, sort of like the Winchester Mystery House, and it badly needs refactoring. I'll be the first to admit that. And one of the things I really want to get going in it is Go routines. Really the stuff that it's doing now, it takes seconds, but it should be almost instant. So I want to get that worked in with Go routines. One other thing, and I'm calling it the big think here, something that's always a problem with reverse engineering, I think, are .NET assemblies, simply because they're sort of unusual. If you pull up a .NET file into, say, IDA or another debugger, it's sort of frustrating. You don't get the nice import information you typically do. However, .NET assemblies are very rich in human-readable strings. They're a little chaotic, but one of my big think items here for the future is to revisit that and say, what can we do with all that to make it do a better job in predicting the behavior of .NET files? So, and then I think we'll really have something very useful. So, and for anyone who wishes to try it out, there's the GitHub repo. And the README file here, it will tell you everything you need to do to get it up and running on a Virgin Ubuntu 16.04 instance. And let's see, we're probably a little out of time, which is fine. But the underlying algorithm, if anyone wants to see another example of how you can use it, if you say, I just don't deal with debugging or anything like that, there's a spreadsheet here that shows how you can use it to predict phishing victims. And I would just say, if it's at all useful to you, if this algorithm, does some good work for you and you want to use it, please feel free to run with it. It's yours. I just hope it's useful to others and saves you as many hours as it has saved me. So. And I think that's pretty much it. Thanks. Okay.